Suppose I should start speaking now. In the program, it said that I'm giving a talk on perfecting mistakes. I thought better was a little bit more realistic, so I'm going to go with better mistakes. Yeah, and we'll just jump into it. That's my cat. He's a good cat. This is the biggest I've ever seen this cat before, so big fan. First time I messed up professionally was in my second job. It was actually, I did some mistakes and stuff in my first job as well, but we didn't really have any users at the time, so like, can you really make a mistake if you don't have any users to see your mistakes? I don't know. Second mistake, my first like, oh shit, what am I doing type of mistake, was when I joined GitHub. I joined there in 2010, kind of as a junior engineer role. And my first month or so, I shipped GitHub in development mode to customers. For those of you who can't guess, that means it gets very slow and very, there's no class reloading on, there's no caching, there's no, really anything. So yeah, that was a mess up. I knew this was a mess up because I got everybody's favorite support request of all time, help, the site is slow, and that's about it. And I was like, well, can you give me a little bit more information here? And they're like, I don't know, it's just kind of slow. So I checked out. I was like, yeah, it's a pretty slow site. What's going on here? Blew like a day on it or something, and then by the end of it, I was like, oh, I misloaded the environment variable. It's actually running it in development instead of production. I'm really mortified here. Yeah, so that's always fun. Then I was just kind of like, oh, well, are we going to lose customers over this? This wasn't on GitHub.com. It was for GitHub Enterprise, which was the installable GitHub on your own servers. So I couldn't just like SSH into their own servers and fix it and stuff. And I was like, oh, are people going to leave because of this? Like, we really kind of messed up this update. Is my coworkers going to get mad at me? Are they going to fire me? Ended up being silly. They wouldn't fire me for another 5 years. But it ended up being like a really kind of frightening thing. But I found that reaction really interesting. Like, nobody got really angry at me, even though I thought this mistake would have been really a bad mistake. And then later on in life, there were a lot of little tiny things that ended up being really, really big problems. And I always kind of find it funny to, figure out why some things are really stressful and really you get a lot of reaction from things, and why some things aren't. And that's what I want to talk about in this talk. How do you gauge user reaction to a mistake that you might have? How do you mitigate these problems? How do you deal with the mistakes that you're bound to make? I think this is kind of an interesting area because you're going to make really dumb mistakes from time to time. Sometimes just bad things are going to happen to you. And how do you deal with that? That really ends up being how we treat our profession and how we can improve our profession. Can everybody hear me? Whew. You don't hear me? How about now? Sorry, sometimes they call these mics the douchebag mics, so it's hard to adjust sometimes. How about now? Spattering of applause. Cool. Yeah, let's get going. I'm Zach Holman. Holman on social media things and stuff like that. And here's a bunch of logos to impress you with. Currently, I'm starting my own company called During. It makes a bunch of calendars, suck a lot less, but not a big deal because it's not even public yet, so ha ha ha, only I get to have it so far. In past lives, I was at GitHub between 2010 and 2015, so I was there about 5 years. There was 9 people when I was there. Now it's like 650 or something insane, so I got to see it grow quite a bit. I was at a small company called Guild before that, and then I advise a bunch of different companies right now, including GitLab, DocBit, and StackShare. So I can't, as much as I want to get out of these dev tool space, I still have to deal with you developers all the time. I keep coming back to you. I love you. So a lot of this talk is primarily based on my past experiences, primarily based on a lot of the things that happen at GitHub. I've been gone from GitHub for 2 years, so I feel like that's enough time to where I can really kind of go back in time and talk about the really cool shit that we never really talked about before. It's less embarrassing now, or maybe by the end of this talk I'll be really embarrassed and then I'll find out maybe I should have given it some more time. But I think that's kind of an it was an interesting company. It's grew a lot. Obviously, you've all probably used GitHub in the past. And we ran into a lot of different mistakes and problems and things that we had to deal with that a lot of them I just found really interesting coming at it from a different perspective. And then, I'll mention some other companies that I know. There's a bunch of other kind of smaller anonymous stories and stuff that I've heard over time because I've talked to thousands of developers and I've heard some really goofy, terrible stories from all of you. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff to learn here. That's what I want to talk about today. First thing is kind of what everybody's really worried about is losing data. You never want to be the person who's like, oh, crap, we didn't need that data, right? I RMRF'd way too hard on that one. This is the problem. My story, or at least my perspective on the story, the entire company was down in RubyConf in New Orleans in 2010. The entire company being about 12 of us or something like that. And we had done the conference. Conference was really fun, and we ended up having to check out of our hotel rooms, but we had a really late flight, so we were just kind of hanging in the hotel lobby, hacking on stuff for a couple hours before we all go into the airport. I'm kind of sitting there, and one of my coworkers, his pager goes off, or phone, and wasn't a big deal because back in 2010, GitHub was still somewhat unreliable. It was still really hard to scale Git at the time. Nobody really knew what we were doing. So it wasn't entirely shocking that either GitHub.com was down or some service was misfiring or something like that. So we're all just kind of doing our own stuff, and the person looks in the database, which was having the problem, and they SSH into the database, and they notice that there's no database anymore. I don't know if you know this, but if you run a data-backed site, it's a really good idea to have a database underneath it all. So the lack of a database was quite shocking. Around this time, Chris, our CEO, who was actually in San Francisco at the time, he kind of popped in the chat room and he was like, I think I know what happened here. And we're all just kind of like, yes? And he's like, well, I was working on our CI, and I'm running our tests and stuff and trying to change a couple of things about the deployment. I think I screwed up some environment variables again, and I ran CI against production credentials, which meant that CI wanted to empty the database before it ran all of its tests. So we were like, yeah, that sounds like what would have caused the problem. So at least then we were like, okay, we know what this is going on. We don't have to troubleshoot this. We're an idiot. Let's just continue on. The data import restore took about like an hour at the time. Even though we had far less data, it just takes a while at some point. So we finally get through the full hour of restoring all this data from backups. And we finally get to the point where we're like, okay, let's click around in staff section. Yeah, all the data is looking just as what we intended to. Probably only lost like half an hour of data or so. This is looking good. So let's pull it out of maintenance mode and then deploy for everybody else. It was kind of like there's one less thing we have to worry about. So at the time, like maintenance mode, I think was just like you toss like a maintenance.html into the public directory, and Nginx would pick up that and say, okay, the entire site's in maintenance mode or something. So to get rid of that, we basically had to remove that file again or move it or something. So the developer did that, removed the file, committed it back up to the repo. You see where I'm going with this? Like, nobody fixed the fucking bug. So we dropped the database again because CI then ran tests again on that commit that removed it from maintenance mode. So that was one of those things where we all just kind of looked up and were like, huh, we're not that smart today, are we? That was in the postmortem, we talked about the first part. We didn't really talk about that we dropped it twice, which was unfortunate. But it's kind of interesting just how that all sort of worked out. The second time around, we didn't want to wait an entire hour, and it turned out like 90% of our data was in the old newsfeed stuff. So we spent like 10 minutes re-importing everything but the old newsfeed data, and it worked out fine. And we had fixed the bug by that point, so we didn't drop it a third time. It's kind of a funny little story, but it happens a lot. Just from a quick Google search and stuff, there's a company called Gliffy where administrator dropped production database last year. Yeah, that sucks. DigitalOcean last month had the exact same thing happen to them. They were running CI, it ran on production credentials, dropped important data, and caused downtime. And And GitLab had a similar sort of incident in the beginning of the year, in January. GitLab's actually a really good example, in part because I advised them, so it makes me look interesting or incompetent. I'm not really sure. But they were kind of doing something really kind of interesting where how this happened, they were working on old spam code, and the spam, they needed to tweak some bunch of stuff, and a developer thought that they were working on a replica, and they tried to drop the database, but they're actually working in production, mistyped something. Things kind of compounded from there. Most of their backups apparently hadn't been working in quite some time, so they could have been completely hosed, but the engineer working on this managed to take a snapshot of everything like 6 hours before he started doing all of the stuff. So they're kind of saved by that. But the reason I bring up GitLab is I think they're really interesting with how they dealt with this problem. Like obviously, it's bad to lose data or to have downtime and stuff like that. But what do you do once you reach that point? I think that's the really important part. GitLab is a really, really transparent, open organization and stuff. Like almost everything is available for you to see how they work, other than I think chat logs and stuff like that. And in this case, like the incident coordination was also done in the open. This is from a tweet from one of the in the middle of it all. We accidentally deleted production data, might have to restore from backup. Google Doc with live notes. And this is the first time I'd seen any sort of site with like scale or any sort of site or service do this at all. And this is basically the Google Doc that their developers are using to coordinate, okay, what's happening? Can I access this? Can you access this? Where's this part of data going? And you can see this in real time, how they're actually tackling the problem. So, just as an aside, like as an engineer, this is really cool to just see how people deal with, traumatic events and stuff like that. They also had a YouTube live stream with like the developers, as you can watch them discuss it in real time, which I thought was really kind of interesting. And people generally they kind of like this quite a bit. It was very refreshing to see a very open attack on a problem that we all kind of run into from time to time. Hopefully not too much. So there's a lot of kind of takeaways I want to mention just on this little first opening part. Number one, bad things happen. And this is kind of the theme in the entire talk. Like, I've worked with really amazing people who have done really, really stupid stuff. I've worked with really stupid people who have done stupid stuff. We're all not immune. And, either you're tired or the process breaks down or, sometimes it's just external events. A hurricane hits the data center. Like, yeah, you should have stopped the hurricane with your hands or something. It's not going to happen usually. So bad things happen, and a lot of the times people will sort of understand, or they'll be grumpy, but they'll say, okay, you're trying really hard, and I want to support you as much as possible, and I think that's really helpful. Back when GitHub first dropped our database, and I guess the second time, I was a little bit nervous about the postmortem afterwards, because that was the first time that I guess GitHub had really had serious downtime that was so obviously our fault. And I was kind of worried, okay, are people going to rip into us, what the deal is? And at the time, GitHub's blog had comments on it. I ended up removing them a couple years later, so haha. But at the time, lots of people used the comments, and they read the long post by the CEO who dropped the database. And it was very comforting because a lot of people, it was 100 or so comments on that post, a lot of people came in and said, oh yeah, I work for a major credit card company, and I caused an 18-hour downtime a week or two ago. Someone's like, oh yeah, I work at a bank. You wouldn't imagine how many times we lose your data. So it was comforting for us, sort of, and then I was just like, well, how does anything work in this frickin' industry? But yeah, people, it's always going to happen. A little bit more specific stuff, test your backups. GitHub was saved by the backups. GitLab could have been really ruined by the lack of the backups working, except that they happen to have that snapshot. But also you should test how isolated those backups can be. Both in terms of your CI shouldn't overwrite production and stuff anytime. But I also mean in terms of who has access to those backups. I've heard recently we'll say an e-commerce company in America, fairly large, just had to pay out a fairly beefy ransom because somebody hacked in, took over their servers and all of their backups. And they paid the ransom because what else are they going to do? Otherwise, the company's kind of gone. And I think they didn't mention that publicly or anything like that. But I'm willing to bet that happens, quite a bit. Like, has anybody here ever been hacked and had to pay a multi-million-dollar buyout to random hackers? See, no one really wants to mention that sort of stuff. But I think it's important that this is kind of what we have to deal with nowadays. So keep that in mind as well. Also, just be really transparent. This is something I really admire in GitLab in particular, just how everything is very, this is what we're doing, this is what we're trying to deal with, this is what we're trying to do in the future. And I see this a whole bunch, especially when, if there's a service outage anywhere, and sometimes things happen and it's going to take like half an hour to fix. Every 5 minutes, just go on your status page and say, yep, we're working on it. That's it. Even if it's the same message over and over again. Because if you have people relying on your service, if you can just pop in every now and then and say, yeah, we're working on it really hard. I got nothing new for you, but we're working on it. That goes incredibly far towards getting people to trust you and realize that okay, yeah, they're working on them. I'm going to lay off them a little bit. And then finally, don't drop your database. Try not to do that. I want to talk about hacking. I thought I'd have a cool joke there. I don't have a joke. Hacking's kind of weird. There's another story I got for you. This was in 2012 or so. I was in Stockholm going to a conference. I was with a coworker. And we had an off day or something like that. We were super jet lagged, woke up at 1 o'clock. We were kind of the only ones awake in GitHub at that point. We were probably 20, 25, 30 people or something. And most people were in America or just had really weird sleep schedules and stuff. So we're ready to go out to lunch. And I see this tweet at GitHub and stuff. And I was like, huh, what is this tweet? And it's oh yeah, the Ruby on Rails repo got popped or something. I was like, well, we should probably take a look at this before we get lunch. And it ended up we didn't eat until 9 p.m. that night. Had a stupid TGI Fridays in Stockholm. I'm still bitter about that. But yeah, it turned out Rails had been hacked, and not Rails, but GitHub. And this was Igor Holmakov in 2012, who basically, there's a really long, big postmortem and stuff if you're interested in how this happened. But he basically used non-blacklisted database attributes that he shouldn't have had access to add his own kind of arbitrary data to our database. Yeah, this sucked. It was on the list of things that I worried about at GitHub, any sort of hacking or anything is actually kind of worse than data loss, because people were hosting their data and stuff with us, and if we really screwed that up and somebody had access to production credentials or something that they shouldn't have had access to, or they get access to code, even though everyone thinks their code is super special and it's really not, but when you say, yeah, this is a safe place to code, you better mean it. So we were kind of nervous about this. How it happened a couple days before, Igor did an issue on the Rails repo from 101 years from now. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't think time travel exists yet, so this was probably a good sign that something weird is afoot. But this was mostly only reported to Rails itself rather than us directly, because he was going on this as a vulnerability in Rails and not necessarily GitHub. GitHub just happened to use Rails. So we didn't necessarily, this wasn't on our radar as much from what I can tell and remember back then. And then, when it happened, this is the commit he made to Rails master. And yeah, this is a problem. Obviously he does not have access to the Rails repo. How did he make this commit? And he basically did the same thing, similar vulnerability, but different page. This was on the public keys page. Where he basically was able to say, okay, I'm going to upload a public key to the Rails repo, and then I can push straight to there. So yeah, that was really crappy. Then again, after all this stuff is done, there's a Hacker News commenter who basically said, oh, this is really great. Igor did something, and then GitHub did something, and they're really nice about it, and there were no lawyers and stuff, and it's really great. So you have to listen to that because it's Hacker News being positive for once. So that's a good thing. But really the joke's on them. We really didn't know what we were doing. We were kind of just flying by the seat of our pants. And I say that just because we'd never really had a serious security vulnerability before. And it was pretty evident that like we didn't have the policies in place to try and make it a very clear split between like white hat hackers and black hat hackers, and all of that sort of stuff. So it was kind of eye-opening for us at the time. In hindsight, like one of the thing I find most interesting from thinking back at this, even though we were a really small company, how we responded to it I thought was really good. And this is how I kind of want to have any company I'm involved with respond to any sort of crisis at all. In this particular situation, there were a lot of things to do. Number one, like you got to fix the glitch. You got to make sure nobody can like attack the public keys page again or something, and that's fine. This can be measured in like a number of minutes. You just have a developer kind of step up and say, oh yeah, I'll take care of this, and I'll start looking around to see if maybe there's some other page that we missed. So that can take like a day or two. But at the same time, we had somebody who said, okay, cool, we're going to fix that, obviously, but we need to make sure we don't have this happen every 2 months or something, and we keep forgetting something, or we don't put in the right code, and it kind of reverts to an old state. So I want to work on something longer term to make sure that we're kind of secure by default. And this was the first time that GitHub was extremely proactive about being secure by default. And ever since then, it's been like, just assume your developers are all idiots and they're going to do insecure stuff. How do we protect the site against that? And this is really kind of the foundation of doing that. The next step was kind of like, we had a team sort of split off to do like external things. This is what I was kind of involved in terms of a blog post, a postmortem, and this is where we started our, we had like a responsible disclosure policy, so let us know before you, commit to the Rails repo and stuff like that. And this is really the foundation a year or two later of the security, the bug bounty program of GitHub, which I think is really successful. But yeah, we had another team sort of working on that sort of stuff. And then finally, we had a team that was only focused on like retroactive things. So once something happens like this, you want to be able to say, okay, we know what happened. We're going to look back as far as we can in all of our logs and archive data and make sure that nobody has access to things that they shouldn't have. So this can take days or weeks sometimes of just having another group just going, okay, has anybody ever made like a post request in this fashion before? Or is our permission system, can we just run a check on that and say, hey, does anybody have access to a repo that we don't have a permission record for and stuff like that? So that took a long time, but like the thing I'm most interested about is like all 4 of these just sort of happened. At the time, GitHub was kind of famously flat, and nobody was really assigned to do anything. We just kind of all split up because people knew what the problem was and what the the long-term implications are. And I think that's like, this is one specific example, but the more you can kind of let people just do their jobs and say, hey, I know you're doing the short-term stuff. Somebody needs to worry about this long-term. I'm going to work on that, and let people kind of float off and do that, the more stronger your response is. I think like overall, I think people were pretty supportive of both of us, both Igor and GitHub's response. We definitely messed up in a few different ways. One of the things that we first did was immediately ban his account because we weren't totally sure if he was, a nice actor or not. And he kind of admitted himself later. He was kind of like an immature thing and stuff. So we got a lot of flack for saying, oh, should we ban this person right away? Should we have worked with him to find other security holes and stuff? It was a really tricky situation. We unbanned him like 2 days later or something. But it's one of those things where you can step back and say, oh yeah, your policy should be this. But unless you've done that ahead of time, once you're in the shit, in the trench, it gets really stressful, and you sometimes don't think as clearly as you should, which is part of the reason why you should start thinking through all these kind of scenarios far before they actually happen to you. But that's not always the case either. So yeah, it's like, at least in terms of organizational stuff, I think allowing people to fluidly break out into what needs doing, especially if you have somebody at least on top who's kind of coordinating all of the response and say, oh yeah, we're missing somebody on like the long-term stuff, why don't you jump on that? I think that can be really helpful. And it should be fine to like allow people to be a little bit more autonomous and say, okay, jump on this when you can, if this is something that you're helpful with and everything like that. Next, I want to talk about botched launches. GitHub launched a lot of stuff while I was there. I've been involved in a lot of other product launches and stuff like that. And sometimes it doesn't work as well as you would hope. The single most important GitHub feature of all time is not issues, it's not pull requests, it's not anything like that. It's organization accounts. Prior to that, we basically had like your open source, and then you could pay like $7 a month for more private repos and stuff, and that was it. And up until that point, nobody, like other websites, didn't really have organization accounts either. You'd have to like share a password with everybody in your group and log in and stuff like that. And this is a really big change in terms of, I can mention people on my team, I can work together, bring people into discussions and stuff like that. And it was cool. And this led to, from GitHub going from like a handful of people to 600 people as it is today or something. So this is a really big feature. And we had been dogfooding it for a number of months internally. This is back in 2010 or something like that. And sometimes you just know a feature is really great. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is awesome. We've worked so much better internally because of this. Yeah, when we're going to ship this, everyone's going to fucking love us. Which sort of happened, except people didn't, or some people didn't. And like what happened is we just screwed up the billing, or we screwed up the pricing. And we ended up having like the organizational plans be way too expensive for most people trying to work on something with their company. Which also makes sense because investment in dev tools and organizations was a lot lower back then. So I think people were a little bit more hesitant to do it. But I thought this was really interesting just looking back because I was 2 or 3 months into my job there, and I always thought that they could do no wrong and stuff, and they kind of fucked up on this one. And they kind of went back like a couple days later and say, hey, yeah, this is wrong. We're going to add like all these different payment tiers and stuff, and and then everything was fine again. And it seems like kind of a little thing, but I remember at the time thinking that was like kind of a weak thing to do. But it ended up being like one of the stronger things to do. Like you have to listen to your users. Even though users are like the worst people in the world, turns out like, they pay your money and stuff like that. So it's important to listen to them from time to time. You can see this in a lot of other areas too. Like Apple's a good example when you talk about like MobileMe versus iCloud. Steve Jobs got up on stage in front of the whole company in 2006 or whatever, and he was just like, MobileMe's terrible. And then he sent out a whole email to all of Apple, which had to have known that was going to get leaked to the press immediately. And it was basically like, yeah, we goofed up this MobileMe launch. Like, what's going on? He wasn't trying to like sugarcoat it and be like, well, we're just learning and stuff. It was like, yeah, we messed up in a big way. How do we make this better? And eventually they turned it into iCloud, and nobody really complains about iCloud and syncing and stuff like they complain about like MobileMe. Because I think like generally, people don't stress out about that anymore because people tend to move on. Like once you sort of attack them and be like, yeah, we goofed up, we need to add a new pricing plan or something, people are receptive towards that sometimes. And I think sometimes you have to kind of go the other way sometimes and say, like, yeah, we messed up. That's kind of a really powerful phrase because nobody likes to admit defeat and culpability anymore. So if you say that, it's very helpful in getting your point across. But not always. Sometimes, it used to be back when Facebook would ever redesign their site, you'd have like 100,000 people signing petitions saying, I want them to change the design back or give me the option and stuff, which is stupid because nobody listens to those. But it was just annoying. And I think they started moving to smaller changes to just kind of get rid of that. But I think sometimes people just hate change for the sake of change. And there were a number of releases we'd have at GitHub where we thought they were great. We got a lot of like blowback from it, but we kind of stayed the course because we could see where we were going. One of the people I have a lot of arguments with back then, but also now, is one of my designer friends. He was like the first head of design at GitHub. And sometimes I would be like, yeah, the screen you designed, I just don't really get it. I'm just not a big fan of it. And he's like, yeah, okay, cool. And then he'd always like pull out a sketchbook of like, okay, this is what I want it to look like in 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. Because he was looking at the long progression of stuff. So he knew that like, okay, this is the step we need to get to something really important. And sometimes your users just won't see that. So there's a weird trade-off between like, well, what do we need to worry about right now? How can we help them get their jobs done faster now, but still get them towards this vision that we are really invested in and we think this is a really good thing for our product? All right, I said users are terrible to deal with. The public is actually kind of worse. They're not even users. They're just people who gripe. But a large part of like what our jobs are building things for people to use. And a lot of times, especially if you're an executive level or VP role or something, or a manager, you're going to be more closer to dealing with external press releases or something like that. But it really kind of impacts all of us in terms of support threads, or if you do like tweets or something about your company, or talk to people in conferences and stuff. There's a lot of interfacing with the public that you have to do. Postmortems is kind of the biggest, for us as developers in terms of, okay, something messed up, crap, what do we do about it? And what did we do about it? And writing a postmortem and kind of explaining this is the flow of what happened is a really good way to do it. And I don't want to talk too much about this because the best talk was by Mark Embriaco. He's talked at length about all this sort of stuff. He's worked at Pivotal, DigitalOcean, Heroku, GitHub, Basecamp. He's worked at a lot of like, high-ranking companies, and he has really good suggestions about how do you write a postmortem. And just to crib from him really quick, one of the first things he says is to say I'm sorry. Like literally, I'm sorry. Like I forbid you right now to ever say we're sorry for any inconvenience you might have experienced. Like you probably inconvenienced them, so just like admit it. It's amazing the number of like people or postmortems or something where you'll see them not actually apologize ever. And that's just weakens, why should I read the rest of it when you're already kind of lying to me? The next step is to demonstrate understanding, basically, of like, oh yeah, we know exactly what happened. The CEO dropped the database. Crap, like you know exactly what happened, so it makes it sound like okay, ultimately, are you going to fix this in the future? And that's really the last part that's really important, is to try and figure out, okay, yeah, something really bad happened, we got hacked, or servers went down or something. This is what we're specifically doing so you don't have to deal with this inconvenience in the future. And this goes back to the idea of, I think people are far more likely to agree with you and understand the things you're going through if you say, crap, we're really sorry about what's happening right now, but you won't have to go through this specific thing in the future. So I think those are like really good things to keep in mind if you're doing even like an internal postmortem to like the rest of your company or the rest of your team, to say, oh yeah, this during a retrospective, this is what happened, this is what we did terribly. Just make this very clear and transparent and go from there. The other thing I wanted to add to this is to be timely. I kind of mentioned this a bit earlier in terms of like having the status page every 5 minutes, just have somebody post like, yeah, we're looking into it. Just being on top of the ball and telling people what your status is really important. And like kind of the pro tip here is I see a lot of times the people who are posting like the Twitter status, for example, of like during a downtime will be the same ones who are like debugging it. So like sometimes you'll see like they'll be doing something like, oh, just restarted the service and now this is doing this and this and this. It's not the right person to do tweets and blog posts and stuff. Like they should be fixing the site. Just have somebody else who's not involved type it out, and then you don't get like typos and all this other crap. It's just a nicer experience for everybody. So try doing that as well. Next thing I want to talk about is red balls. This is an interesting term. Mostly grabbed from David Simon's book, Homicide. It's from the Baltimore Police Department in the 80s and various other places. They use it in Minority Report too, if you're a big Tom Cruise fan. Who isn't? A red ball is basically, in the context of like murder police in Baltimore, if you get a red ball, that means this particular case is really, really important. Like there's a lot of press pressure on you, or the mayor's daughter got kidnapped or something. Like your career is basically on the line if you mess this up, because everybody's looking at you and you kind of have to drop everything else you're doing to work on this really, really important stuff. David Simon also called these shit storms and clusterfucks. So that's like the level of really bad stuff that happens. And occasionally, if you run a service with enough people, enough customers, like things like this will happen. The first step I would kind of suggest is to assemble your council of elders, kind of like in Lord of the Rings, where, actually I don't know, I fucking hate that movie, so it's not like Lord of the Rings, but just imagine it's a bunch of people who have been tenured at the company for a long time, have kind of understand the subtleties of the business. They understand everyone from all the players in the game, from users to stakeholders to everybody. and kind of get them in one spot to tackle these big red ball problems. At GitHub, we called this Hazmat, kind of like the dudes who, go in biological hazard places or something like that. It was basically just a separate chat room where we had some execs, a couple lawyers, some marketing people, kind of a small handful of people who only focused on like the really important stuff, and maybe something would only come up every couple of weeks or something, or every couple of months, depending on how big GitHub was at the time. But it was just really helpful to have a specific team, and we could like CC these people on issues and say, hey, can you come in and check this out? Some people. There's a lot of different ways to sort of facilitate this type of thing. Like, it doesn't have to be somebody you have to hire. It's just like, these are the people that are involved in these really hard decisions. And surprisingly enough, this came up a decent amount at GitHub. We had a number of problems with foreign governments. China and Russia both blocked us a couple of times, and there was big protests and stuff on Weibo about like, oh, we got to get GitHub back and stuff. And we're just kind of like, we're not diplomats. How the fuck do we deal with this? But like the people in like Hazmat and other groups were able to help us out internally. We had a lot of like child porn and stuff uploaded to GitHub. I have no fucking idea why, but like that's really delicate to have to deal with, and legally you have to worry about different stuff. A lot of high-profile news stuff, even if it's not about GitHub. Sometimes some really, to take a random example, like the NSA tools got pushed to GitHub like a couple weeks ago or something. Like, these are not things that we didn't set up the site for, but like they're really important things to have to deal with them or not dealing with them at all. So those are like really important decisions to have to make. The other aspect of this that I want to mention is like, this needs to be a really diverse team, not just in terms of like the makeup of the person, but also in terms of get people from very different teams, get like technical people on board, get non-technical people on board, because if these are really tricky situations to deal with, like if we're trying to negotiate with China to like unblock our site, you want people from different perspectives to give you a better standing on saying, okay, this is what's going to help us. This is the best way to go about it. By definition, they're just really hard problems, and like you need people who are really good at this sort of stuff. And just have like a private place for them to break out, either like a chat room, or if you're all in the same city, actually have a meeting room sometimes to actually talk about this, and get the right people on board. Like, I could never really do this because kind of like a lot of engineers, I'd just be like, whatever, fuck them, like, it's fine. But like, sometimes it's really nice to have really patient people, and they're like, oh no, we can find a solution and all this sort of stuff. So you kind of want like both of those people to butt heads in a really nice way to try and figure out, what is the best way to support everybody involved here. But just don't make it too big, because too many cooks means you can't make any decisions whatsoever. So you have to find people who are still patient enough to be able to have good discussions, but ultimately, like, this is a place where you have to make the hard decisions and stuff and go from there. So when I'm talking about all of this sort of stuff, one question that you may want to ask is like, does this even matter? Like, why are we going to all this extent? I got to worry about so many other technical stuff. Why do I have to worry about all of the bad things? And that kind of brings up a good point of like, you can't endlessly be reactive. Like, we can't just sit here trying to figure out what could happen and what might happen, and we actually have to like build stuff sometimes, apparently, as engineers, which is a real bummer. But like, sometimes it's important to like charge forward, and you can't actually sit down and hold hands and get through stuff all the time. So I think there's you have to spend a lot of time kind of wondering, is this a legitimate concern? How big of a deal is this? Is this a bigger deal than even we think? Could it get bigger? Could it get easier over time? Sometimes you legitimately fuck up, and you have to figure out ways of tackling that early. So the best way to kind of tackle this, I think, is one, make it as data focused as possible. Because once you add data to any sort of discussion, it becomes easier to argue that on the basis of actual facts and say, oh yeah, 20% of people use this feature less in the last month because we've added this new feature or something, or changed this design. Then it becomes very easy to be like, oh yeah, well, we can fix that. But if you're just kind of going back and forth with like vague discussions, it gets a lot harder. I've seen a lot of people sort of tackle this over time. Like at GitHub, we would check Twitter mentions of @GitHub. And we could graph that against like deploys, and we could graph that against lots of other stuff. And we could figure out like, okay, are people more angry at us right now? Or what is the deal? Can we get more data in figuring out like, is this impacting a lot more people? You can do the same thing with like support requests. If there's a lot more support requests coming through, just basically as much data as you can get on this, the faster you can start tackling the problems that actually matter compared to the ones that are just annoying for the meantime. The other aspect of this is just kind of being overly generous. Like if you do mess up, you make a really bad mistake, you make a bad judgment call, and something it didn't work out like you wanted it to. Be nice to your users. The best way to do this is just give out free shit. Like nobody hates getting free stuff. And the number of times, I have people that I onboarded early on into GitHub Enterprise like 7 years ago, and may have had a problem early on, and maybe we comped them like $5,000 worth of hosting or something for the first year or something. But they've been on it for 7 years, and they've probably paid hundreds of thousands of dollars since then. So in the long term, like you want customers to be there, so why not help them out as much as you can in the meantime? Because it's like two things. Like one, yeah, people like free stuff, that's cool. But two, the mere act of saying, oh yeah, we really messed up. This is not what you're super pleased about. This is not something you're happy with. We're not happy about it, and we're not happy about it so much that we're going to give you a month free or something like that, or give you a t-shirt or something. It's amazing what those little tiny things will kind of, pop in people's heads and say, oh yeah, they're different from other people. Like they actually do care about me, and I'm going to stay there for another decade or something like that. So I think that's kind of interesting as well. Just to wrap up, all of this stuff that I talked about is really just about pressure. How do you deal under pressure with really bad things that you may not have anticipated early on? And it really is a kind of a reflection of your organization as well. Like, it's really hard for an organization who have really hard problems with internal communication to get through, dropping their database or something like that. Like, how do you even start with that? So, a lot of these things, like, yeah, you can work on, okay, do all of our backups restore correctly? Can our servers do so and so? But like at the end of the day, like, can you facilitate better communication inside your team? Can you communicate between teams a lot better? Because you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen, but you can create a good framework to where everybody else helps everybody else out. So when there really is something bad happens, you just kind of coast through it a lot easier. One of my buddies said this quote. He said, business process is the result of previous trauma. I think he stole it from somebody, and we couldn't figure out who he stole it from, so we're just going to say Corey Donahoe wrote that. He had a few beers too, so I'm not really sure what he meant by that. But what I think he meant was, any processes in a business is just naturally as a result of something happening before, either at that company or they're worried about something else happening or something like that. And our industry tends to rail on business process, like, oh god, I don't want to have to go through all of this sort of stuff. And almost all of my talks are based on that premise, so I'm no different. But like at the end of the day, like, you do build up defenses. An organization's sort of like your white blood cells in your body, where it identifies, okay, this messed up for us. We're going to add all of these things to make sure that doesn't happen before, and in the future this happens, and it's like, well, yeah, it's similar, we're covered by this, and so on. So I think it's like, important to recognize that, yeah, it is cool to, be reactive in some sense and say, this got us once. How do we make sure this doesn't get us again? And like codify that in actual business processes or technical limitations you can place to make it less risky for you. So yeah, this is just me getting up and saying a bunch of stories and stuff. So I don't know if you got a lot out of this or something, or hopefully it just makes you rethink either mistakes you've made in the past, or mistakes you're making now, or mistakes you'll make in the future, and kind of think of it in a new light and kind of tackle it in a different way. And most importantly, I just hope we all leave this talk and make a lot of awesome mistakes tonight. So that's what I got. Thanks.